Welcome to DBCY. Today we begin a new digital series where we, the leaders and teachers of Dunwoody Baptist Church, try to tackle certain tough questions that believers and skeptics alike might have regarding the Christian faith. I'm Gary McEntire. I get to be your host. Some of the topics we discuss over the duration of this series might be mere curiosities to some, while others might be what's hindering people from taking a step of faith toward Christ, or maybe might have even caused them to lose their faith along the way. The purpose of our series is to address those questions and concerns for those that might have them. In today's episode, I'm joined by DBC Senior Pastor Alan Jackson and Student Pastor Brian Smith. Together, we're going to discuss, why does God allow evil? Why is there evil and suffering? How could a loving God allow so much suffering? So, Alan, at Brian, as we begin to address these questions, I know we can probably all think of people who've made this statement. I'm no longer a Christian because of this. I think immediately of Ted Turner. He had some kind of crisis of faith because his sister was sick or something. Charles Templeton, who used to tour with Billy Graham, he said he saw the evil and suffering in the world, and that steered him away from faith. And so this is a question that's been with us for a long time. I would say this before we get into that. Alan, this is kind of leading into your next sermon series, right? Can you kind of lead us into that?
It is. We are going to spend the summer with questions that Jesus actually asked. And in, I think, Luke chapter 11, they actually asked him about this. And he said, we're all going to die, and you need to repent. And so he addressed this very question, but the podcast series is for us to deal with questions that people are asking, and the sermon series is to deal with questions that Jesus asked.
Right, and I want to actually make this an ongoing series. So even beyond what you're doing, I want to keep this thing rolling because, there's no end to the questions that people have, and I think that we can speak to those in a way that they need to hear them. So, Alan, I'm going to start off with you then. So someone approaches you and asks you the question, I don't believe in God. How can a good God allow evil to exist? What's your response to them?
Well, what I would say here, and Brian can help me, there's a huge topic called the problem of evil or the problem of suffering. And it's probably the number one objection that people have to becoming a Christian is because they ascribe evil to something that God either, what are the three assumptions? That if God is so powerful, then he could stop evil. If God is so loving, he would want to stop evil. If evil still exists, either God is not powerful or not loving. And so that sort of frames the whole problem of evil discussion, and then from there it gets personal, right? My grandfather passed away, my wife got hit by a car, my cousin got cancer. Why would God allow babies to die? And so that becomes a place where many people who follow Christ are almost instantly on the defensive because they feel like it's their job to defend God.
Yeah. I think it's not just death, right? It's not just a kid who dies. It's a kid who suffers. And it seems so unfair. And I think it's unwise a lot of times to not acknowledge how unfair and awful that stuff
We're
is.
absolutely tone deaf if we say, if we try to deny that suffering exists.
Yeah.
The pain in someone who's grueling it out through chemo, or who, like you say, even worse yet, watching a child or an older person or someone who is in the prime of life and was hit by a drunk driver. Mm-hmm. Those are for us as believers to say, oh, we can't know the mind of God. It's just dismissive and condescending, and it's tone deaf to what they're really asking.
Yeah, I think there's truth, but there's a way too that is like it wounds, right? It wounds harder. Yeah. This isn't exactly the question you're asking, but I think there's something too about when you see how people respond to suffering, what like the way you view God impacts the way you respond to those moments of suffering.
Right.
And just this last week, I was at a funeral for a 6-year-old. His name was Will, Franklin. He had a rare disease that was called Mirage, some bizarre, um, super, super low probability chance of survival. And the doctor told him his mom, when he was born, he would be lucky if he ever made it to 2. And he got through a whole year of kindergarten. He got to play like on a baseball team.
Oh, wow.
He got to ride a bus to school. They talked about at the funeral how excited he was just to be able to ride the bus. Something that, so people take for granted. But I just bring that up because when Sarah, my wife, and I were at the funeral, we were in the church, and we look back and we see his mom as she's about to walk in, and she collapsed, like fell to the ground, sobbing. Her dad had to pick her up, like sobbing. And they walked into the front of the church, and they were singing Will's favorite church songs. And the mom, who was collapsing under the weight of the suffering in the lobby, was worshiping harder than anyone else in the service. And that's, I don't know, man.
That's hard to explain that though.
That's
It's,
powerful.
when as a pastor, I'll go to visit an older member of our church this afternoon who probably doesn't have many months left, and my prayer for her is that she will sense the very presence of God.
Yeah.
I can't try to pray for healing in a way that makes her think that somehow I can say abracadabra and call down healing from God. At the same time, I believe in healing. I believe that God can alleviate suffering. I believe that God is powerful, is loving, is present, is knowing. At the same time, I can't know everything about his intentions. And I can only say personally that some of the pain that I've experienced in life, I look back on and go, he was teaching me something in that pain. But that's a really lame thing to say to a non-believer.
Yeah. I just think, I think about Megan, that mom.
Yeah,
But when you see real faith collide with real suffering,
right.
it's heartbreaking, but it's also beautiful. There's something there that, like, even if you're not a believer, when you see it, you're like, what in the world?
That they've got something I don't have. They have a resource. I'm a rational person, and I often, whenever I hear somebody accuse God of not alleviating suffering, I think, well, if somebody doesn't believe in God, who do they blame?
Yeah.
If they don't believe in the existence of God at all, they are as naive as I am if they don't acknowledge that the world is a pretty crummy place, that there's a lot of things that happen that are horrible. And if you don't believe in God, who do you blame? And so the problem of evil rests solely on the discussion about the existence of God.
So I'm looking at both of you, and I realize youth pastor. I've been in youth ministry. I mean, it's like, and if I had to try to trace it back to like an unbroken line from now to you, I mean, when did you start in student ministry? Late 70s, early 80s?
Late 70s.
Yeah. So, I mean, in all this time, it seems to be the one lingering stumbling block that keeps popping back up is this idea of evil and suffering. And it's not restricted to people like on their deathbed or tragedy. I mean, we have kids who are asking these kind of questions. And I look at you and I'm wondering, like, how does this one even do student ministry these days? Things have changed so much even since when I was doing it. So if someone approaches you with these questions, what kind of concerns and challenges are you seeing with the kids under your ministry?
Yeah. So I think this question is always, we do question series. We ask kids to submit questions.
Right.
Usually once a year, once every other year. And every time it's the same question that gets brought up over and over and over again. And it's hard to give like a concise answer because I'm a rambler, like in general. So this is the way I always kind of explain it or this is the way it makes sense to me the most. God never promises that the world that we live in is the perfect world, right? The promise of the perfect world is there will be a new heaven and there'll be a new earth, right? Revelations 20, that this earth will flee from his presence because there's no room for him, right? This, the world that we're in now is the world where God is preparing the perfect, world. And there are some things, and then the perfect world that can't exist without this space in between it, right? So like a perfect person would be a person that was full of faith, but would never have to struggle with doubt again. Or a person who had bravery but didn't have an enemy to fight against, or a person who had knew what it was like to be forgiven without ever sinning again.
Right.
And part of the world that we're in now is God preparing us to be the people who will be in that new heaven and be in the new earth. So we need an enemy to fight. We need battles to win now, knowing that one day there'll be a place where there are no tears, and there are no suffering, and there is no hate.
See, I like this one day thing that you were talking about, because it kind of leads something that has been on my mind that I'm reminded of, is that evil and suffering, they're only for a season. It wasn't God's original plan by any means. We managed to break that and break it pretty good. And we have a whole Bible that tells us, all right, this is what God's doing about that. And there's definitely this future hope that we have that evil is not going to persist. Suffering is not going to persist. And the question comes up, well, why doesn't God put an end to it? Because he could. If he's all loving, if he's all powerful, he can put an end to it anytime he wants to. And I start thinking, well, okay, yes, he could. But what if he did that 100 years ago? What if he did it 1,000 years ago? Who misses out? All of us. We don't get to enjoy God because we weren't even born.
He never promised that he would end it here.
Right.
As
But he's going to end
as
it.
Ryan said,
Yeah.
it's a fallen world. And even when Jesus was asked about this thing, I talked about it a minute ago, the context was that he told a story of a tower falling and killing some people. And the question was, did they do something that caused them to deserve to die? And Jesus' answer was, we all deserve to die.
Right.
And if you don't repent, you will die forever. And his context was what Brian was saying, that it's to focus on this world is sort of the wrong question. That's not to deny the reality of suffering. I think your job is harder now with students than mine was in the 70s, because there was now the truth is based on the feels, right? If I feel bad, then
Yeah.
whereas a lot of generations, and of course this discussion can be traced all the way back to Epicurus and the Greek times, that the problem of evil, the problem of suffering, C.S. Lewis wrote about it. Every thinker has written about it. Alvin Plantinga has written about it. This idea that we have to have an explanation. And that to me is the source of where I would have a conversation with a non-believer. Why do you have to have an explanation? Why does everything have to be explained?
Yeah.
Why do we have to blame somebody for something or excuse somebody for something? Does bad stuff just happen?
Yeah, I think it's important too to say, especially when we talk to students, that it's not God causing you pain because you did something that made him angry, right? But at the same time, like another example I talk to my kids about, the students about a bunch, is like like bike riding. I want all my kids to ride their bikes, and there's no way to teach a kid to ride a bike without them getting hurt. Like they're
Right.
going to fall off their bike at some point, and I know they're going to fall off their bike. I'm not going to cause them, like I'm not going to kick them off their bikes while they're riding because that would make me a crazy person. But I put all my kids on bikes knowing they're going to hurt themselves, and knowing that the end goal would be worth the process they went through. And that stinks when you talk about like real pain, talking about like the mom who suffers. But I think there's truth in that as well. Like why do people want to blame things? Because something inside us knows that there's more to the world than what we
It's
see,
not
what we
right.
experience.
There's
Yeah, we
more to
feel
this.
it. But when I talk to students in student ministry, I talk about knowing the character of the Father. Like if my kids didn't know me and trust me and know that I love them, then when I put them on this metal contraption that causes their knees to bleed, they would question, like, why would you do this to
Do
me?
you really love me?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But because they know me and they know my character, they trust me to get back on the bike, even though it hurts them. And now they can all ride. Maybe not downhill super fast yet, but they're doing it. And I think it's the same thing. It's a perspective that we can't totally grasp because we're too young. Like You know what I mean? When you're young, you don't get why your parents let this stuff happen, and you get older, you look at it and you're like, oh, I see it. In the same way, like I know the character of the father, and even though my perspective isn't old enough to understand why he does what he does, I have to be willing to trust him until I'm old enough to
I
see it.
think the key is he does allow
Yeah.
suffering, and sometimes it's as like when you see your son doing something foolish on a bicycle
Mhm.
that you know is going to result in more pain than he really needs. You let him
Mhm.
because he needs to learn from his decision making.
Yeah. My dad's favorite quote to me as a kid was, "If you're going to be dumb, then you better be tough." There's a lot of times instead of telling me not to do something, he would be like, "All right, I hope you're tough enough to handle
You're going to
whatever
be
you're,
dumb. You
you're
better
about
be
to
tough."
experience."
Well, I preached a sermon a few weeks ago that says that sometimes bad things are because of the culture.
Yeah.
We're in a fallen world.
Right.
Sometimes bad things are from natural dynamics, the famines, the floods, the building collapsed.
Which is also it's a part of the groaning under the weight of sin. I mean, everything's breaking down.
And then Romans, Paul says that in instances of depravity, he lets the consequences of someone's sin run its full course. And so we do have a God who allows suffering, but we cry out to know his presence. We cry out to know his character. We cry out to know the heart of his love. And I can't ever say enough of that to convince somebody who's decided that the problem of evil is keeping them from becoming a follower of Christ.
Yeah. I think the other thing, and then what makes Christianity so unique and our faith so unique is the way the scripture tells us to prepare for suffering. Like at no point in the Bible does it say the more you love God, the less you'll experience suffering, right? The son who God said, "This is my son, I'm proud of him, well pleased," experienced, social isolation, pain, the separation at the cross. Like he went through all of that. I can't remember who said the quote, but there's someone who said that Jesus suffered on the cross, not that we would avoid suffering, but so that our suffering would have a purpose. That we don't suffer for no reason.
Right.
We suffer under the love and the guidance of God, even if we don't understand why.
And I think we see that in the agony of Christ on the cross.
Yeah.
That in the Garden of Gethsemane, he prayed that if it was possible that this suffering would be removed, but the purposeful commitment to whatever God was up to, God just let us see purpose in this. Let us on the other side of it. Gary, you said it that most suffering is temporal, and in the picture of how long a life is on earth, it is temporal.
Right.
We'll go to Israel and see things that are thousands and thousands and thousands of years old, where we stoop and find an old penny and we go, "The Jesus is old," and it's 40 years old. Mm-hmm. But our perspective on suffering is that it's forever when you're in it. But in the big picture, it's temporal. Not to excuse it. It's
still awful. But I think knowing the heart of the Father and trusting that his perspective is better.
Yes.
Is the thing. And you were talking about like, why does God not just step in and end it all now? That's First Peter, right? He doesn't tarry. He doesn't wait the way people think he waits.
Right.
The heart of the Father, the desire of God is that all would come to repentance. That's why he's pausing and waiting, because at the heart of the Father is at the core of all of these things.
Right. I mean, just even the idea to think that 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, God put an end to it, and the fact that, all right, well, then I'm out of it. I mean, that's just. I mean, that just makes me grateful, even whatever suffering I might be going through, because I can't think of a single person who has died, maybe is in heaven, and they'd look back and say, "Man, if
I wish these doors were closed."
Yeah.
Like,
it's like, no, it's not worth it. It's not worth it.
I think too, like, because the question is like, why does God allow evil at all? Like, why does he allow people to make decisions that hurt other people? Why does God allow those things? the other part of that is God desires a true relationship with his people, and you can't have a real relationship without choice.
Right.
Like if you force someone to love you, it's not love, that's abuse.
Abuse.
And so God allows humanity to make choices.
And the consequences of their actions.
But at the same
That's the only
time,
way it works.
Yeah.
the same time, I wouldn't see the absolute scandalous beauty of grace unless I could see it against sin.
Yeah.
If I didn't see the reason that God sent his only son so that whoever would believe in him would not perish but have everlasting life. If I didn't have a view of perishing, I wouldn't have a value in that eternal life.
Yeah.
And there is something to be said for that one of the big picture purposes of evil is to show us the purity or the beauty of God's character in contrast.
That's what I meant about this is the process that God is in to create the perfect world. Right. So we're not in that now, but like the goal is there will be people in heaven who you have been redeemed, but will never have to pray for forgiveness again.
Right.
And some of those characteristics that like create like the ideal humanity, the ideal person, like can't be experienced without the evil in the world.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So one of the things, and y'all both have spoken to this already, talking about how you see people who suffer and endure well. To me, there's probably nothing more moving than seeing someone who you know is going through all kinds of suffering, but the witness that they bring through that. I mean, how much more can they touch the life of somebody else who is going through that same thing, especially if they're a non-believer, and they say, look, this is how I got through that. How much more, or they might be open from someone who's experiencing the same thing. I think that's one of the reasons why God allows, Christians to suffer. If for no other reason, I don't know. The thing did a thing. So it's one of those things that God allows people to suffer because, all right, this is the witness. This is how people can be drawn to me. And so he might put that thorn in our life for no other purpose than to bring glory to himself.
Yeah.
So what else? As we close this thing out, what else you might want to bring to the table?
I think Brian said it. We can't ignore suffering or dismiss it or condescend. It is real, and in the Bible is full of stories of people who suffered. Job, Joseph, Jesus. Jesus allowed the disciples to learn through suffering. He could have calmed the sea as soon as it became a problem, but he allowed the disciples to struggle against the wind and the waves. And there is a sense that we are not genuine if we try to say that there is no suffering. At the same time, we are some kind of prideful if we think that we can eventually come up with an explanation for it.
Well, I mean, it's like you just reminded me of Paul writes about all those things that he had to go through, the times that he was shipwrecked and beaten and stoned and whipped and scourged and all that stuff. And I think one time he mentions that he was lashed 5 times. And I'm thinking just last week was the first time it hit me. That's what happened to Jesus, and he did it 5 times. And you got to think, the second time he knows what's coming. And the third time and the fourth time, he knows the suffering that he's about to go through, yet he endures through it all. And that's just a powerful testimony to me. And I'm like, could I do that? I like to think I can. But just the idea that the same thing Jesus went through 5 times.
Yeah.
On top of all that other stuff.
That moment in Mark 2 when he's on the boat and he calms the wind and the waves. I've tried to write a message on this. I can't word it in a way that makes sense to other folks. But I always think about the biggest miracle in that moment was not Jesus stopping the storm. It's that he was on the boat with him. Right? Isn't that crazy? In the middle of the storm,
didn't he just walk across? Didn't know how he got there?
Well, this one they were going just across the water.
Oh, so this was a
This one
different
he was taking
story.
a nap. They were mad at him.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Sleeping during the storm. But he what a crazy idea. It's not that Jesus stops the storms in your life. It's that he's in the boat with you in the storm.
That's great. I love that.
Powerful.
Yeah.
I'd say this, just to go back, I know because we're trying to wrap it up.
No, I'm not.
With students, one of the things I bring up a bunch is that knowledge doesn't equal causation, right? knowing that something's going to happen. Because one of the things that people bring up is like, if God is all knowing, he knows the stuff's going to happen. So he must be the one who's causing those things to happen. And I don't think that knowledge automatically equals causation. Right.
Right.
So like, I'm an awful basketball player and I'm out of shape now. Right. But if I was going to play 1-on-1 against LeBron, I know I'm going to lose. I know that, but me knowing that doesn't cause that to happen.
And you would still try.
I'm still trying, but I'm going to lose. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Oh, yeah.
So I think it's the same way. God's knowledge doesn't require that he causes evil, right? Knowledge doesn't automatically equal causation.
Right. Yep. All right. Anything else?
Well, there's lots and lots, but we probably need to wrap this up.
Well, we're going to do a lot more of these, so we'll have time.
Are we asking folks to like comment? Are we posting this in place where they can comment?
Yes. Matter of fact, I'm about to talk to them about that in just a second.
Oh, because that'd be an easier. It'd be more fun to come back and respond to comments about what was said. Do you know what I mean?
Awesome.
All right. So we hope you join us for next week's episode of DBC Why, where I'll be joined by DBC's executive pastor, Alan Tolliver, and discipleship pastor, John Hume. In that episode, we're going to tackle the question, what happens when we die? If you're new to Dunwoody Baptist Church, I'd like to know more about us. You can find us at dbc.org. If you have any questions or if you want to follow up to any of the questions that you've just heard, if you'd like to ask some more questions, if we haven't answered enough for you, contact me at digitaldbc@dbc.org. That would also be the address where you could submit your own challenging questions, and we'll try to get to them if we have an opportunity. If you're on social media and found any value in what you heard today, we encourage you to share this link on your media pages. So thank you again for joining us. I'm Gary McEntire with Alan Jackson and Brian Smith. We'll see you next time.